A man lived alone in a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest. He enjoyed the solitude, finding peace in the quiet of the wilderness. One cold autumn night, as the wind howled outside, he went to bed early, wrapping himself in a thick blanket to keep warm. Around midnight, he was abruptly awakened by a faint, persistent knocking at his front door. It was soft but deliberate, as if someone was gently tapping to avoid alarming him. Groggily, he got up and peered through the small window next to the door. In the dim moonlight filtering through the mist, he saw a woman standing about 10 feet from his porch. Her long hair was disheveled, and she wore a thin white dress that looked completely inappropriate for the chilly weather. She stood perfectly still, her face obscured by shadows. "Please," she said in a trembling voice. "Let me in. Someone's chasing me." The man hesitated, his heart pounding. Something felt off. Why wasn't she coming closer to the door? And why didn't she seem cold, despite the biting wind? "Who are you?" he called out through the door. "What's going on?" She didn't answer his questions, only repeated her plea. Her voice grew more desperate, but she still didn't step closer. Sensing danger, the man decided not to open the door. Instead, he grabbed his phone to call the police. When he glanced back at the window, the woman was gone. The man cautiously opened the door and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The mist had thickened, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. On the ground near his porch, he noticed something that made his stomach drop, a trail of blood droplets leading from his porch into the forest. The next morning, he shared the incident with some locals at a nearby diner. Their faces grew pale as he described the woman. "You're lucky you didn't open the door," one old man said, his voice shaking. "Years ago, a woman was murdered in those woods. Some say her spirit roams the area, trying to lure people into the forest. Those who follow her, they're never seen again." The man never stayed in that cabin again. To this day, he wonders what might have happened if he had opened the door that night. The Secrets of Room 104. The young woman, Sarah, sat frozen in her car outside the small countryside hotel, her heart pounding. The words of the hotel receptionist echoed in her mind. "You can stay in any room you like, but don't go near room 104. The warning, coupled with the receptionist's nervous demeanor, had sparked her curiosity. What could possibly be so dangerous about a locked room? That night, Sarah tried to sleep, but the allure of the forbidden room tugged at her thoughts. Around midnight, unable to resist any longer, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the worn carpet of the hallway. She carried a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as she approached the door marked 104. To her surprise, the door wasn't entirely locked. It creaked open with a gentle push. Sarah stepped inside, holding her breath. The room was cold, unnaturally so. A single bed, neatly made with a faded floral quilt, sat against one wall. A tall wardrobe loomed in the corner, its dark wood polished to a mirror-like sheen. But what drew her attention most was the painting. It hung above the bed, a portrait of a man with piercing blue eyes and an unsettlingly stern expression. His gaze seemed to follow Sarah as she moved across the room. Her stomach churned, but she couldn't look away. Then, the door slammed shut behind her. Startled, she spun around and tried to open it. The handle wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her chest as she tugged harder, but the door seemed to be sealed shut. A faint whispering sound filled the room. Sarah turned back toward the painting, and her blood ran cold. The man in the portrait was no longer sitting still. His head had turned slightly, and his eyes were locked on hers. "You shouldn't have come here," a deep voice rumbled. It wasn't coming from the painting, but from behind her. Sarah whirled around, her flashlight flickering. The wardrobe's door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Yet, she felt a presence, an icy, malevolent force that seemed to seep into her very bones. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an incomprehensible cacophony. Desperately, she clawed at the door, her nails scraping against the wood. And then, silence. The door swung open as if it had never been locked. Sarah stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. She turned back to glance into the room one last time, but it was empty. The painting was gone. Trembling, she fled back to her own room and locked the door, determined to leave the hotel at first light. But sleep did not come. The next morning, Sarah went down to the lobby, her suitcase in hand. She tried to compose herself, but her pale face and shaking hands betrayed her. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, noticed immediately. "You went into room 104, didn't you?" she asked softly. Sarah's eyes widened. "What's wrong with that room?" The receptionist hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she gestured for Sarah to sit down. "Years ago, a man named Arthur Caldwell stayed in that room," she began. "He was an artist, brilliant but troubled. He painted that portrait you saw, the one of himself. He became obsessed with it, claiming the painting held a part of his soul. One night, the other guests heard him screaming. When we broke down the door, he was gone. The only thing left was the painting," and she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We could swear his eyes had moved." Sarah shuddered. "Why keep the room open at all?" "We tried to close it," the receptionist admitted. "But strange things kept happening. Doors slamming, lights flickering, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Guests complained of nightmares, even when they weren't staying in the room. We locked it up and hoped people would stay away." "But the door wasn't locked," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "And now he's free." As Sarah drove away from the hotel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her rearview mirror seemed darker than it should be, and every so often, she thought she saw a flash of blue eyes staring back at her. By the time she reached her home, her nerves were frayed. But the nightmare was far from over. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the faint creak of a door opening. Her bedroom door. She turned her head slowly, heart pounding, and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. His eyes glowed faintly blue, and his voice was cold as ice. "You shouldn't have come here." The room plunged into darkness. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life spiraled into chaos. The entity from room 104 seemed to follow her everywhere. Lights flickered in her apartment. She heard whispers in the dead of night. Shadows danced on her walls, even when there was no light source to cast them. And the worst part was the painting. It appeared one morning, hanging in her living room as if it had always been there. The same piercing blue eyes, the same stern expression. No matter how many times she tried to remove it, burn it, throw it away, destroy it, the painting always reappeared. Desperate, Sarah returned to the hotel, determined to find answers. The receptionist greeted her with a mix of relief and fear. "He's with you, isn't he?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "How do I make it stop?" The receptionist sighed. "There's a legend. They say the only way to break the curse is to return the painting to the place it was created, his old studio. But no one knows where that is. Caldwell was secretive, and his studio burned down shortly after he disappeared. There has to be a way," Sarah pleaded. "I can't live like this." The receptionist hesitated, then handed Sarah an old journal. "This belonged to him. Maybe it has the answers you're looking for. But be careful. The more you delve into his world, the more power he gains." Armed with the journal, Sarah embarked on a journey to uncover Arthur Caldwell's past. The journal was filled with cryptic sketches and fragmented writings, each page more disturbing than the last. It spoke of a remote cabin in the woods, where Caldwell claimed to have discovered the secret to immortality. Sarah's search led her deep into the wilderness, where she found the charred remains of the cabin. Among the ashes, she discovered a hidden trapdoor leading to an underground studio. The walls were lined with paintings, each one more twisted than the next. In the center of the room stood an empty easel, and beside it, a note scrawled in Caldwell's handwriting. "To escape the portrait, one must finish what I started." Sarah realized what she had to do. Trembling, she picked up a brush and began to paint. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, but she didn't stop. As the final stroke fell, the portrait began to glow. Caldwell's voice echoed through the room, a mix of rage and relief. And then silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, the painting was gone. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. She returned home, hoping the nightmare was finally over. But late that night, as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard the faint sound of a brush against canvas. Somewhere, Arthur Caldwell was painting again. The highway ghost. The drive had been uneventful for the first few hours. The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the car's headlights and the faint glow of the moon. Kate and Mike, a young couple on their way to visit friends in a distant town, chatted idly to pass the time. But as the night deepened and the highway became more desolate, a strange unease settled over them. "We haven't seen another car for miles," Kate murmured, glancing out at the dark expanse of fields on either side of the road. The faint outline of distant trees swayed in the wind, casting long, spindly shadows. Mike nodded. "It's like we're the only ones out here. Kind of creepy, isn't it?" Suddenly, Kate gasped. "Stop the car!" Mike slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Ahead, by the side of the road, stood a figure. It was a woman, her long hair hanging limply around her pale face. She wore a tattered dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and she raised one hand as if signaling for help. "Do you think she's okay?" Kate asked, her voice tinged with concern. Mike hesitated. "I don't know. It's dangerous to stop for strangers, especially this late at night. But what if she's in trouble?" Kate's eyes pleaded with him. Reluctantly, Mike pulled the car over and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" he called out. The woman approached the car slowly. Her movements were stiff, almost unnatural. As she drew closer, Kate noticed her bare feet and the dirt that clung to her dress. The woman's voice was soft but strained as she spoke. "Thank you for stopping. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a ride?" Kate looked at Mike, who frowned but gave a reluctant nod. "Sure," he said. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," the woman replied, climbing into the back seat. "Not far." As they drove, the air inside the car grew colder. Kate wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She glanced back at the woman, who sat silently, staring out the window. "So," Kate began, trying to break the awkward silence, "where are you coming from?" The woman didn't respond at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Home. But I couldn't stay." Kate frowned. "Why not?" The woman's eyes met Kate's in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, they seemed impossibly dark. "Because it's gone now." Before Kate could ask what she meant, the woman spoke again. "You can let me out here." Mike glanced around. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and darkness. "Here? Are you sure?" The woman nodded. Mike slowed the car to a stop, and the woman opened the door. "Thank you," she said, stepping out. She turned and began walking down the road without looking back. Kate watched her until she disappeared into the shadows. "That was strange," she murmured. "Why would she get out here?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know. Let's just get going." They drove in silence for a while, the strange encounter weighing heavily on their minds. But as they rounded a bend, Kate gasped again. "Mike, look!" Ahead of them, standing by the side of the road, was the same woman. Her pale face and tattered dress were unmistakable. "How did she get here?" Mike whispered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "There's no way she could have walked this far so quickly." Kate's voice trembled. "Maybe she needs help again?" Mike shook his head. "No, something's not right." He pressed down on the accelerator, intending to drive past her. But as they neared, the woman stepped into the middle of the road. Mike slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. The woman stood motionless, her dark eyes fixed on them. "What do you want?" Mike shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The woman tilted her head slightly. "You should have kept driving," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. The car's engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, plunging them into near darkness. Kate reached for her phone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Before he could answer, the woman was gone. One moment she was standing in front of the car, and the next the road was empty. But the oppressive cold lingered, and the shadows around them seemed to move. They eventually managed to restart the car and drove in terrified silence until they reached the next town. At a diner, they recounted their experience to an elderly waitress who listened with a grave expression. "You've seen her," the waitress said quietly. "The highway ghost. They say she appears to travelers who stray too far from home, warning them to turn back." "Why?" Kate asked, her voice trembling. The waitress's gaze was distant. "Because if you don't listen, you might end up like her, lost forever on that lonely road." Kate and Mike exchanged a glance, their faces pale. They didn't need any more convincing. The next morning, they canceled their trip and headed back home, vowing never to take that highway again. But even now, late at night, Kate sometimes dreams of the woman in the tattered dress, her dark eyes watching from the shadows.